So what I want to do now is kind of move. I want to move through the journey to Jerusalem and through the passion, trial, passion, crucifixion, and resurrection in Matthew, and then come back and deal with the parables of judgment and talk about them because they're a little more complicated and they need to be contextualized. Excuse me. And then uh, I think we'll have time. I have actually some slides to kind of engage you in some conversation around that, like the kind of like questions about, given this, what does this mean? Kind of Luther questions, like what does this mean about us? What does it have to do with us, kind of thing. I want to just remind you, and I want to highlight one passage and show you how to read a passage through the Sermon on the Mount, like I mentioned to you last night, because I think, in a sense, every one way to read Matthew is like every character or characterization of somebody should be viewed through the lens of the sermon, right? Like, does how they're speaking and acting align with the sermon? And this is a great story about the rich young man in Matthew, because he really presents himself as kind of a pious Jew, and Jesus challenges him around his faithfulness in an interesting way. So you all know this story. It says, then someone came to him and said, "Teacher, what good deed must I do to inherit eternal life?" And he said to him, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good." So it's interesting. Even, I mean, we've all been in this situation where either we've done it or somebody's come to us. He's basically trying to butter Jesus up, and Jesus is he's not having it, right? He's like, "No, we're not playing that game. Good teacher, we only know God is good," is what the implication here. That's actually said in the other gospel, in Luke. If you wish to enter into life, keep the commandments. And he said to him, "Which ones?" And Jesus said, "You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and mother also, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." This is a little different than in Luke, actually. And the young man said to him, "I have kept all these. What do I still lack?" And Jesus said to him, if you wish to be," and he uses the word teleos here, "if you wish to be whole, not perfect, nobody's perfect. If you wish to be whole, go sell your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." And when the young man heard his word, he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. So I'll do the second part in a minute. So again, what's happening here is that this is not like somebody who claims to be a good Jew and says they kept all the commandments. This is about I mean, it's interesting that Matthew uses the word, "if you wish to be whole." I mean, he's actually referring him to the community, right? In other words, in order to be faithful, it's not just about following these rules. That's not how Jesus understands the commandment. Jesus in Matthew, as in the other gospels, summarizes the law and the prophets in love the Lord your God with the Shema, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. That is the whole Torah summed up. And that's the heart of it. So on the one hand, on the face of it, this person just looks like, wow, this is really a very, this guy's keeping all the commandments. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. But Jesus kind of challenges him. And I think we tend to think here, I think these passages scare us because we think, actually in Mark and Luke, I think he says, "Give everything you have to the poor." And so we always think of it about what we have to give up. But I mean, I think this person, it's also about reconnecting them to the community in a sense. So I just lift that up as and then what's interesting is that he says to his disciples, Truly, I tell you, it would be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, the eye of a needle, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astounded and said, who then can be saved? But Jesus looked at them and said, for mortals it is impossible, but for God all things are possible. Then Peter said in reply, look, we have left everything and followed you. What then will we have? So basically, Peter also is been, his mind has been colonized by the empire, and like, what's in it for me? I mean, it's in contrast to, taking up your cross, losing your life. You're not losing your life, but it's like there's a difference between living this way that Jesus is teaching and always asking, like, what's in it for me? And what does Jesus say to them? He says, truly, I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Humanity is seated on the throne of his glory, you who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones. This is unique to Matthew, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And then this is what's in Mark and Luke. And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last will be first. Oh, it's interesting. I've forgotten that. I was thinking that this was follows Mark, but he changes Mark. Mark actually has, will not receive in this lifetime many more brothers and sisters and mothers. In other words, in Mark, Luke doesn't have, or Matthew doesn't have that. In Mark, what Jesus says is that when you stop thinking about yourself, what you gain is a community. That's in this life. But Matthew actually refers, because Matthew is very, this is important to say now, especially in this section in the second part of Matthew has a very kind of apocalyptic worldview, right? I mean, again, there's a lot of apocalyptic literature in Judaism, and it's almost written in the context of oppression, right? It's, in other words, the idea of apocalypsis just means revelation. So real apocalypses in Judaism typically are, the idea of the heavens open is an apocalyptic imagery where sometimes people take tours of heaven in Jewish texts, whatever, but the idea is that what's revealed is that God is in charge, and that things are in heaven as they should be, and they will be on earth. That at the right moment, God will restore all things. So it's very future oriented, and again, that makes sense. 20 years after the Jewish wars, where what happened after the Jewish wars is that the decades after were very difficult, because what happened is that the Romans used the destruction of Jerusalem as an example to all the peoples of the empire. They basically rubbed their Jews' nose in it for years, for decades, saying this is what happened. Basically, they used that as an example of this is what happens when you step out of line. This is what happens to people who do that. So what you get in Matthew, and this is this is challenging for us, because this is where you get this apocalyptic worldview, which then gets twisted in a lot of different ways. You get a lot of this stuff in other forms of Christianity, this sort of focus on the end times and all this stuff, and it's a little, it kind of gets perverted. Here it's more, the function of it is to assure people, again, of God's continued presence with them, right? That's the function of it. All right, and then so I'm going to come back to the labors and the parables here in this section. You have another, the last of the three passion projections, and then I'm going to walk you through the time he enters Jerusalem to the trial, crucifixion, and resurrection, and Matthew's take on that. So I'm not going to read the passage. You all, Matthew follows Mark very closely here. So, this is what we read on Palm Sunday. It's in Matthew 21, the so-called triumphal entry, which is ironic, right? I mean, in other words, Jesus marches with a crowd of people um, um, into Jerusalem on a donkey. And what he's doing, this is so fascinating. What he's doing is parodying or mocking these royal processions, right? In other words, he is riding on an ass. I mean, so basically, whether they be rulers or military leaders, they have these sort of pomp and circumstance kind of processions into the city. And so Jesus is doing that as this sort of lowly servant king, right? This Davidic king. I mean, he's mocking that royal kind of ideology, if you will, even as a kind of a people's king, if you will, or people's Messiah. And so when when we read this, as we often do on Palm Sunday, kind of straight up, um, we're misreading it, because it's not so much acclaiming Jesus as it is mocking that kind of I always say it's like the Saturday Night Live version of a procession, right? It's do you know what I mean? Like it's Jesus kind of making fun of people who are full of themselves, leaders who are full of themselves. I mean, and that's very a Matthean perspective, is that it's very critical of leaders who are full of themselves and care more about their own status and power and wealth than they do about the people, right? And then of course, what happens after that? He goes into the temple, and he overturns the table, and again, this is a kind of economic thing here. I mean, throughout all the synoptics, I think Luke has more than anybody on sort of the use and misuse of money, and exploiting people. Luke, that's a big theme in Luke, but it's here also in Matthew, and this is what's behind the temple tantrum, if you will, where he's angry. He's angry here in the temple, and it's important that we affirm this side of Jesus, even as we affirm our own anger. When you get angry at injustice, I mean, so we mentioned already that the word dikaiosne means justice, and it means that in a covenantal sense. That is to say, it's about the good of the whole. It's about people being in right relationship with God and one another. And so the opposite of that is injustice. And so the response to injustice is anger. And it's not a out of control anger. He's not, but it's a symbolic demonstration, if you will. It's almost like an action, right? We would call this an action organizing, where you do a symbolic action to a prophetic action to signal that this is not right. And what he says when he overturns the tables is he cites Isaiah and Jeremiah. It says, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer." It's interesting. The other gospels have for all people. Matthew does not have that, although again he does have the Gentile focus. My house should be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers, right? So in other words, you're exploiting people with a temple tax and the buying of these sacrifices and what have you. And then Matthew adds, the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. That's what he does in the temple. He cures people. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard, and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry, and they said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself." He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. Yeah, so I was going to say something about this, and I just lost my thought. Yeah, it's just a contrast to how Jesus behaves in the temple compared to how it's functioning. Again, I was going to say about the temple. So, I mean, there's not, the point here is not, Jesus is a second temple Jew. So it's not a, I think a lot of times there's a misunderstanding that somehow he's against the temple. That he's a second temple Jew. I don't think that he is, but he's critiquing how the temple is being administrated, what it stands for, and what it's doing, instead of being a service to people. The temple also was a bank. So it, actually Crossan paints a very vivid picture. He even has some drawings in one of his books of these, the priestly aristocracy living high on the hog in these terrace houses, and then the people, and then you have here the lame and the children, the people hurting in the temple, purchasing sacrifices and being taxed, right? So he's always juxtaposed. These are actually like scenes in a movie where they're juxtaposing, the scenario. People at this time would imagine, they know what the priestly aristocracy is like, and they know, as we say of politicians, sometimes they're out of touch with the people, and then what the real people are experiencing on the ground. It's a similar thing happens the way the story is told, where the in the Synoptic Gospels, again following Mark, but both Matthew and Luke have they have this strange story of Herod and Herodias dancing, and this is where his daughter Herodias comes, and his daughter comes and dances for him, and he says, "I'll give you whatever you want," and they're at this banquet, and she asks for, her mother tells her to ask for the head of John the Baptist. That scene is a vivid depiction of the kind of self-indulgence of elites. That's what that scene is there for. And then immediately after that, in all three gospels, you have Jesus feeding the people. You see what I'm saying? So this is where, like, if you just have that passage and you don't see what it's juxtaposed against, you don't see the contrast. But it's meant to contrast. They're constantly contrasting the world as it is with the world as it should be, if you will. That this is how the leadership acts. This is how people they just are self-indulgent elites, and this is the people, the majority of people who are hurting. It's really about that to some extent. Okay. And then we'll come back to the parables. There's a bunch of them here. There's a bunch of parables and judgments, and then it's in 22. It's pretty late in Matthew's gospel, 22:34, where it says the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. They gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law of the Torah is greatest?" And he said to them, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So, I mean, again, Jesus is a man of the people. He's not teaching elaborate exegesis of the Torah. He's teaching the heart of the Torah, and this is the heart of the Torah. And we should take a lesson from that. And then a chapter in 23 that is unique to Matthew, which we'll use to set up the parables of judgment, if you will. So this is a long, very, I would say, almost vitriolic kind of diatribe against scribes and Pharisees. And I'm going to read part of it to you, the first part, because this text is actually a window onto the community's tension with the scribes and Pharisees in their own time, right? In other words, a lot of these, the way the Gospels are written, you ever seen, I actually have a print of one when we were in Europe I think it's might be from the Louvre, I'm not sure. It's just a print. But in like a lot of in the Middle Ages, when they would paint paintings of Jesus and scenes from the Gospels, whatever, they would actually paint them in a way that the people in them, Jesus would be kind of an ancient Jewish person, but the people around them would be their contemporaries, right? You know what I mean? In other words, they're setting the scene within their own context. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So that's a lot of what's going on here. That's just why, it's important to pay attention to like what the context is, not because we're trying to just to understand what happened, but what the Gospels are responding to. So in this section here, I think I said last night that Jesus is debating with Pharisees and scribes because he has more in common with Pharisees and scribes than anybody else. Like, you only argue with the people that you have something in common with, right? He's not arguing with Sadducees. That one time there's one encounter in the Gospels with the Sadducees who basically are just trying to set him up. They just want to make him look silly, and he makes them look silly. They're arguing. The Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection ask Jesus a question about, if a woman marries 3 times, who will be her husband in the resurrection? And Jesus, I'm summarizing here, I don't have the text memorized, but he basically tells them that the punchline is God is God of the living and not of the dead, right? That you don't even understand, you don't have any clue what the resurrection's about. It's not, it's a silly game they're playing with him, and he just shuts them down. So he doesn't really debate them. He just kind of makes fools of them in a sense, but he's debating throughout the Gospels, he's debating with scribes and Pharisees. And as we know, there are Pharisees and scribes who are a part of this movement, and they probably were from the beginning. In fact, Luke is especially clear about this, distinguishing the scribes and Pharisees who come from Jerusalem to like local scribes and Pharisees. But in Matthew, it's probably the local scribes and Pharisees that have been dismissive of this Messianic Jewish community. They see it as just, a problem, probably. And so this reflects the tension with the Matthean community and the Jewish leadership in Antioch, probably. So this is what Jesus says. Jesus said to the crowd, this is Matthew 23. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach." That is what the sermon has been about, the Sermon on the Mount, right? I mean, is that, and he's actually acknowledging that they teach the right thing, but they don't do what they teach. That's the purity of heart. That's the integrity piece. And this is what they do, he says. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. We're back to the yoke of, take my yoke upon you, not the yoke of the Torah as the Pharisees and the scribes teach it, who just load you up with a bunch of rules. And that is a kind of a legalistic thing if they're doing that. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make phylacteries broad and their fringes long. So basically, his accusation of the Pharisees and scribes here is that they really reflect more the Greco-Roman culture of honor. They're more concerned about their own honor and status, about their own self, than they are other people, the people they serve. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, where you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven, for you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourself. So, I mean, it's a frankly, what he's accusing them of, and again, I don't know what, it's hard to know the reality, but this would be almost kind of a kind of fundamentalism, right? I mean, that's what it would look like to us, this sort of very strict thing that just makes is sort of judgy and makes people obey a bunch of rules and stuff. And it goes on. It goes on for another 36 verses. So I mean, it's a very he's lighting into them. I mean, I say Jesus is lighting into them, but I think it's really Matthew here. I mean, and again, this is why I'm just, I guess, repeating myself, but this in this part of the gospel, the part that is Matthean, the way Matthew is edited and added material, it reflects a lot of pain. It reflects the pain of rejection, and being dismissed. And so I'm not excusing that, but I mean, there is, despite the sermon's call to love your enemies, peacemaking, mercy, all those things with which the Matthean Jesus preaches and embodies, there's a very human side here of people in pain who are angry and because they've been burned. And I think it's important to understand that when you're reading these texts, because otherwise texts like this get weaponized, right? You understand what I'm saying? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that gets weaponized, where it's just a source for anti-Judaism, but all kinds. I mean, people use these texts to weaponize. They weaponize them to beat people down, and that's a problem. So it's important with both to be both judicious and empathetic, to understand that this kind of rhetoric comes out of pain and marginalization, and somehow, I was telling the pastors on Thursday that there are parts of these texts that actually show our shadow side, the shadow side of being human, right? And what's interesting is that I mentioned last night the Deuteronomic perspective, which is one where we tend to read, like all these, even these hard stories in the Pentateuch. There's some really horrific things that happen, and we tend to read the text as if God is in every situation. That's not how Jews read them. They read these texts, and a lot of these really hard texts, these really texts that can even, women have written about, the abuse of women in the Pentateuch and whatever. But the way Jews learn to read these texts in exile, and the Deuteronomic kind of perspective is self-critically. In other words, when you see a hard text and you're challenged by it, the way a Jew would read that is to look in the mirror, not to blame somebody else. You see, am I making sense to you? Yeah, and I don't think we do that. I think we tend to read everything as kind of God is always in every situation, and that's not true. I mean, in a sense of authorizing every situation. I mean, it's true that God's presence is ever present. I'm not saying that, but part of what I'm saying is that these are, as I think I said last night, the word of God comes to us through these texts, but sometimes it is a word of self-reflection, that we have to look at ourselves and not just preach what we're reading or teach or hear what we're reading. We actually have to be critical and self-critical. I want to just stop there for a minute, because I think that's hard, and I want to just see if people have thoughts about that.
Okay, so I remember when I wrote this down, Jews thought in community, not individualistic. So I wrote this part down. You said last night, what did we do to deserve this? And how do we make it right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, exactly. That's the Deuteronomistic perspective, which is the perspective after exile. When they're exiled, they ask the question, like, what did God do this to this? What did we do? And basically they answer that question by they don't answer it specifically, but they basically answer it by saying we need to align ourselves with God's ways.
And that was one of the first things that I thought of when I was hearing about what was going on at 9/11.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
what did we do to deserve this? How
Yeah.
do we make this right?
That's
And
a
I thought,
beautiful example. Yeah, that's a great
oh,
example. Yeah.
yeah,
But our tendency was to it became I mean, we took that event, which is a horrific, traumatic event, but then we weaponized it to condemn all Muslims, all Islam, right? That's what we did. So that what you're saying is exactly right. And I'm not saying we weren't responsible for that. That's not the point. The point is like, how can we make this right? That's really the point. So that's a really helpful thing to say. Is this hard for people? I mean, you need to tell me if it is, because I think, this is where, and like I say, we'll come back to the parables of judgment, but all this stuff, there's a sense in which we have to humanize this text and see both the writers and ourselves as human beings with a shadow side that we have to reckon with. That's what I'm saying. And that's hard. We don't want to do that. We want to just, this is part of the hard part about discipleship, is actually looking at ourselves a little bit. Yeah. I'm going to look at the chat here. There's something here, but
I think that we've all kind of seen it too, though, whether it's within family members or whatever, when something goes wrong, like somebody gets cancer or whatever, it's like, what did I do?
yes, yeah.
That sort of thing happens. And I think we see it more than we even realize.
Yeah, I agree. We're kind of conditioned to see it, right? I mean, and that's, we call that theodicy. It's like, why? Yeah, you're right. We do have a version of that. And there are a lot of examples that a sickness in the family or something is a good example of that. And it's a time to reflect, not to blame either oneself or others, right? That's the problem. But I think these texts kind of somehow they kind of lead us to place blame. And Matthew might be doing that. I mean, Matthew is kind of doing that to some extent. So this is where I would put a check on it a little bit. Any other thoughts about that? I'm looking at the chat here real quick. Yeah. I'll read what I'm seeing here. I saw a pastor online who is replacing the creed with the Beatitudes for Advent. That's a nice idea, to have it in front and center for the congregation at the beginning of the year. That's actually really consistent with what we're saying, is that, yeah, what if you said the Beatitudes every week, and then you heard everything through them? And like I said, like this part, what I'm saying about 23, it's in tension with the Beatitudes, right? I mean, it's important to see that Matthew is actually not consistent with that. Yeah,
I
so
think the Native American ones you read us would be great to do that with.
yes, the Beatitudes. Yes, yeah, I think so too. I really like them a lot. Somebody's asking in verse 21, why did the translator use the word perfect rather than whole? It really makes a difference. It does. And I mean, I've complained about that ever since I've been able to read Greek, because perfect, teleos means, Matthew uses that word more than any of the gospel writers. And it means fulfillment, which for him is fulfillment of prophecy, fulfillment of Torah. And it means wholeness. That's what it means. It has nothing to do with being perfect like we understand that term, right? With that's our issue. So I would just say it's a bad translation. And then someone puts, it seems normal to blame ourselves, but that is not always the case. The world is not a kind place. Exactly. Yeah. So I think part of what I'm talking about here is actually a way of reading, not just that the text is not, you can't always read it straightforwardly. It's just take it at face value. You have to ask what is, it's just a good thing to ask, even if you can't fully answer it, like what is going on in this text, and what is going on here about what it means to be human, and even not only our good side, but our shadow side, because that's what gets us in a lot of trouble, is not reckoning with our shadow side. And we all have one. I mean, we, you know, I don't know about you, I certainly am guilty of this. When I read the Gospels, you know, I find myself always wanting to identify with Jesus, but you know, more often than not, I probably am part of the crowd, you know, which is a character in the story, kind of just standing there passively watching, you know, or Peter, you know, who doesn't really quite get, you know what I'm saying? So who we identify with. And sometimes we have to identify not just with the protagonist or the hero, but with the little characters who are not always on their best behavior. Okay. Time check here. Okay. And then in 24, he predicts the destruction of the temple. And of course, what happens is so in the trial narrative, it's the charge, which is a false charge, is that he says he will destroy the temple. And he doesn't really say that. He's saying the temple will be destroyed. And again, if you're living on the cusp of the Jewish wars, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that something bad's going to happen, because things are fermenting and they're building, right? But I think it's important to say that the real reason Jesus is brought to trial by the Sanhedrin and then turned over to Pilate is for the temple incident, because that is what you know, I think Luke has the most accurate accusation when he says, I forget who says it, and one of the Jewish leaders says, you know, the problem is he stirs up the people, right? That basically the reason. What do you think is the reason? I mean, again, we theologize the crucifixion. What do you think is the reason? I need somebody to try to answer this. What do you think is the reason Jesus was crucified? It's not preordained. The crucifixion is something the Romans did, right? It's not something God does. What God does is bring life out of death. The Romans execute people. Why was he executed, you think? I mean, and from the story, what do you think? Yes, exactly. Somebody put an attempt to stop the movement, threat to power. Yeah, really, very simply, the only reason the Romans execute anybody, and they execute a lot of people, is for sedition, for subverting the order. We're back to the order again, to Pax Romana. That when I mean, and again, the Romans don't. Pilate doesn't even want anything to do with this, but the Jewish leadership is upset. This is why they blame the Jewish leadership. They're upset with him because he's created this disturbance with the crowd in the temple and stirred people up. And this is then seen, you know, this is why they blame the Jewish leaders, because the Jewish leaders don't have the authority to deal with it. So they turn him over to Pilate. So this again, we're back to the gospel writers are actually kind of unveiling, if you will, the whole system here and how it works. You see what I'm saying? You have to see that here. This is not about Jesus is very he's very once he is arrested, he is very passive, and basically he's in the mode of the suffering servant of Isaiah, right, where he doesn't really even speak or defend himself. He just kind of lets them do their thing. It's almost like he's stopping so you can see what the system does to people, how it creates victims of people, and how their propaganda about justice is really injustice. So you actually have to have a kind of a structural lens to hear this story to some extent, and see it not just about Jesus, but about the world and what it does to him and what it does to people, right? Because he's in solidarity with people. So again, here in the Gospels, Jesus is predicting the destruction of the temple, but the people that are hearing the story, the temple has been destroyed, right? So this is and again, they view not just the gospel writers, but the Josephus and a lot of people blame the Jewish leadership for this. That's why there's so much focus, and it's unfortunate for us because this has been the source of anti-Judaism, right? Like there's a caricature of the scribes and Pharisees from this gospel, and John especially, and then that becomes fuel for this is who Jews are, right? So we always have that in the background of viewing all Jews and Judaism through this lens of this critique of scribes and Pharisees, which is really not a critique of scribes and Pharisees, but a critique of leadership. It's a critique of leaders who are self-indulgent, power-hungry, greedy people who care only about themselves and not about the people. I mean, that's the simple truth there. And that's true. That's true today. It's been true forever. I mean, I'm not saying all of them, but I'm just saying that's the way of politics. So I won't say a lot about that. You all know that. And then the prediction of the coming Son of Man. So this becomes very apocalyptic here. Some more parables we'll go back to in the next session. And then, the plot to kill Jesus, you know all that. And of course, Judas gets involved in that. Matthew's following Mark very closely here. The only one of the distinctive things in Matthew is the death of Judas. That's only in Matthew. We won't say much about the Passover and the meal. That's a meal of solidarity with Jesus. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. Gethsemane, the betrayal and arrest. It's interesting that they come out to arrest him after Judas kind of turns him over. And he says, what, you've come out with clubs and swords? I mean, again, it's almost a critique of a violent culture, right? That here I am, I'm this like unarmed Jew from Galilee, and you come out with clubs and swords, again, telling you something about how the world think about all the stuff we're having now around policing. And then they take him before the high priest, and this is where the way the story goes is that basically they bear false witness against Jesus. They are false testimony, right? They basically accuse him of saying that he would destroy the temple when he never did say he destroyed the temple. I'll actually find here what they say. Now the chief priest, this is Matthew 26. Those who arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas. Actually, I think in the other gospels, Mark anyhow, I think Luke as well, they don't tell you who the high priest is. Matthew actually tells you it's Caiaphas. I mean, they do earlier in the gospel, but Matthew names him here. Who had arrested you, took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had gathered. But Peter, following him at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. So everybody's now at a distance from Jesus. He's on his own. And now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for false testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death. But they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. At least two came forward and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. He didn't say that. The high priest stood up and said, have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you? But Jesus was silent. So this is, again, he's adopted now the persona of the suffering servant. And then the high priest said to him, I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, you have said so, but I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Humanity seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has blasphemed. Why do we still need witnesses? You have now heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict? They answered, he deserves death. They spat in his face and struck him, and some slapped him, and saying, prophesy to us, you Messiah, who is it that struck you? And then Peter denies him, and then he's brought before Pilate. And I actually have some slides. I'm going to wait till next session to talk to them, but Pilate is an interesting character. I think I mentioned last night that the interesting piece that Matthew adds to Jesus before Pilate is Pilate's wife, who has a dream and says, you shouldn't do this. And what's interesting, this is an interesting depiction of Pilate. So we know from other sources that Pilate was a thug. I mean, he literally was a thug. I mean, he executed people, hundreds of people, I mean, without having any reason. So we know that about Pilate, but Pilate is kind of whitewashed in these narratives. And so it's like he's comes across as that, like, I don't really want to do this. I don't really see the need for this, but if this is what you want, I mean, I'll do it, and I kind of wash my hands. And so there's some, it's, you know, if I could say this, it's a sort of typical political kind of thing, kind of wishy-washy thing, where he has all the power. He has absolute power, you know, to not do, to say, and this is how injustice works in the political system, right? It's like, well, I can't do anything about this, but absolutely he can. But he's playing along because it's all politics. It's all politics, if you will. And then he's brought before Pilate, and then you have the suicide of Judas. And then, you know, the whole crucifixion scenes, and he's crucified. They mock him. And then in Matthew, at the crucifixion, you have this earthquake. And I'm going to wait to talk about the resurrection in Matthew, because I actually have a slide and a picture that I'm going to share with you about Matthew's resurrection. I'll wait for the next session. So let me see what time it is. Yeah, so it's about 8:47. Let me just stop here and see if there are things you want to ask or say. Oh, I need to look at the chat. Sorry, I'm not very good at looking at the chat. Yeah, he was in the way of maintaining the status quo, right? Political reasons. Leadership doesn't want to be challenged, questioned, their power taken away. Exactly. Or be embarrassed in front of a ruling Roman leaders. Yeah, all this is exactly right. We all know this, but I'm saying that when we, so part of what I'm suggesting is that, and it's difficult in our context, because politics is so polarized and dysfunctional, that when you talk about, so we probably shouldn't use the word political, but there's a sense in which, I mean, in the sense that that word means something in our culture. But it seems important to me that, you know, to talk about public theology here, that when we tell the story of Jesus, we should be talking about how the world works and how leaders operate. And you know what I'm saying? Like, if you just read this as a pious story, it's not faithful. It's not a faithful reading. Jesus is a man of and for the people, and he's dealing in the world of people who are of and for themselves. That's the world. That's the world as it is. And so if we don't contextualize that in our world, what that looks like, whether it's at a local level, I would say maybe more local level than exactly same now. You know, then because partly this is why I got involved in organizing, right? Is that community organizing on a local level, because there's a sense in which this is a call to action, in a sense. Like, you can't, like, if you see this, how can you not act together? You know, nobody can act themselves, but this is a call. This is exposing or unveiling the system, so that people see a clear choice between what the world offers and what Jesus is offering, a way of life together that is life-giving and that is alternative, and resisting this way. That's what you have to see here. I mean, at a basic level. Okay. I'm out of breath. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Phil puts in here, exactly right. When Pilate comes off as not so guilty, but Matthew values hypocrisy, knowing what's right and not pursuing it is condemned roundly by Matthew. Exactly. That is the way we act unfaithfully by the norms Matthew establishes. He is totally outside the world as God would have it. Absolutely. And this is why you get now why I'm saying you have to have the sermon as the lens to make sense of this, because otherwise you don't see the tension. The tension is a creative tension, because it's what inspires us to act, if you will.